All right, folks, so on today's video, we're going to be talking about how to join billets into a two-piece takedown with the brass and steel sleeve that you can get from Three Rivers. So to do this project, you're going to need a couple of things. Obviously, the sleeve, and when you get on the Three Rivers website to order these things, they come in two different sizes. The one that I'm holding here is the larger size, and the one that we're going to be using is the smaller size. Now, I personally prefer the smaller size because I like a relatively fine handle, but if you like a bigger handle, or if you're trying to make a super heavy bow like 70 plus pounds, maybe you want to get the bigger version. But for most of your bows, most of your hunting weight bows, you know, up to 60 pounds, 65 pounds maybe, the smaller sleeve is going to work just fine. The epoxy that we're going to be using is this product from Smooth On MT13. It's just a two-part, works really well. And then as far as the tools goes, primarily a big rasp, like a farrier's rasp. I don't have one right here on the table. And then we also, a little bit, are going to be using a little pull saw. You don't have to have this, but it will come in handy. And then something to scribe lines, either a Sharpie or a pencil or something like that. So there's a couple of advantages to billets. One is that you can get them for cheap. Number two is that it's a lot cheaper to ship these shorter pieces of wood. And it's much easier to find really good wood in short sections than it is to find one really long stave. And so you're going to be able to come across these pieces of wood much more affordably. There's a couple of different ways to make takedowns. If you're on my Patreon site, you'll have access to some videos where I show you a different method. But these steel and brass sleeves are actually a pretty good method, but there are some little peculiarities that you got to be aware of to make these things work really well, and we're going to go over all of those things. Now, these billets that I have here are really good. They're deep, but the ones that I'm going to be using in the video are really shallow. They're really small billets. And so I'm going to show you a couple of additional steps that's going to help you to make use out of that really marginal or small pieces of wood. So I've got these two billets down, chased down to one ring on the back, and they're pretty small billets. Now the bigger of the two is there's enough wood there so that I can fit this small brass piece to it, and there's going to be plenty of wood there. Now the other piece that I've got is a little bit on the shallow side, and so there's not enough wood there to fill up this steel sleeve that we've got. And so what we're going to have to do is flatten this off and just glue another piece on there to build that up so that we'll have enough meat here to fill this up so there's not much play in it. So I'm just going to take my rasp, knock this down flat as I can, and then I'm going to epoxy another piece of wood there, and I'm just going to use the same epoxy that I got for fitting this onto the billets. So we're going to let this cure and come back to it. We're going to go ahead, while this is curing, we're going to go ahead and fit this other piece. All right, so we're going to go ahead and fit our brass end on the bottom billet. So I need to mark how deep up we need to recess this thing so that this will fit right over the top. So I'm just going to lay that on there, make a little mark. Should mention that I went ahead and squared up the end of this billet so this thing is perfectly square. So now I'm just going to lay this on the end, and I'm going to use a Sharpie so that you can see it, and trace around the inside so that I'll know how deep to recess this. So we're going to go to the outside of that Sharpie mark. So when you're putting this on there, you don't want, I could hammer this on there and force it, but that's going to distort the sleeve here, and it's not going to fit into the other sleeve very well. So it needs to be a tight fit, but not a forced fit. All right, that's pretty good, but I've got right in here, so it's hitting this shoulder before it hits this one, so my two shoulders aren't perfectly square, and it would work fine like this, but it wouldn't look the best. And so I'm gonna move this up this way just a little bit to square these two things up so that this insert piece sits flush. I'm gonna do that with the saw. That's better, much better. All right, so we've got sticking out just a wee bit here, so we'll end up rasping that off, but that's a pretty good fit. Just trying to fill up any little small voids that were around the end of this. So if you get on Three Rivers website and start reading the reviews about these things, one of the gripes that people have is that they tend to be a very tight fit and they're hard to get on and off. And you can see that from this. I mean, that's, if I push that on there all the way, I wouldn't be able to get that off. And so I'm gonna have to do some sanding on this brass piece. Now, luckily brass is pretty easy to sand, but if you push this on there and then pull it off, you can kind of see where the steel is contacting the brass. And you can take a little mill file or just some sandpaper around a sanding block and find those striations where it's marked up the brass here, and just sand that portion of it and just keep fitting it until you get a perfect fit. People gripe about it, but you know, I would rather have a super tight fit like this and be able to fit it perfectly than to have two pieces of metal that are just kind of sloppy and have a sloppy fitting handle. So I'm fine with this. There's also a couple of little ridges in here that could be sanded down. All right, that's pretty good. Still a little tight, but that's all right. It'll loosen up over time. Now, what I want to do is go ahead and fit this to our other limb. Before we do that, we'll put a mark right here on this thing so that this, when we fit that other limb on there, I want this to go all the way over this sleeve and butt in to this bottom limb. And so I'm going to give myself just a little bit of play between here, maybe a 1/16 of an inch or so that our two pieces don't butt up. There's just a slight gap in there just so I can make sure that they're not going to be interfering with one another. Like we did the bottom, I'm going to set this on here. I'm going to scribe the inside, and then we're going to go ahead and recess that. I'll go ahead and transfer this mark over so that I'll know how deep to go. Okay. Now, I will make mention that when I am laying this on here and drawing out the inside, this tube, this sleeve, has a flat part and then a rounded part. Obviously the flat part needs to go towards the back, and so for this stave, I'm just rotating this thing until I've got that lined up with the flat of the back here. So now I just need to recess this. All right, so I've got this top piece on here, but you can see that there's a little bit of a gap up here at the front, and it's touching here at the back. And so I'm gonna have to bring this back up a little bit so that this will slide all the way up. Good enough for government work. So there is a little bit of oil inside of this thing when you get it from Three Rivers, and so I'm just going to take a little bit of acetone, clean that out. This fit doesn't have to be exactly perfect. You can kind of force this one on here because this, once this sleeve is on there, it's staying on there permanently. So try not to get any of this on the very end there, because once you've got that sleeve on there, it's going to be real hard to clean off, and that's going to take up that gap. And not allow these things to fit all the way together. So just slide that on there. Give it a little tap to set it. Now we'll just set it up. Let it cure. So I'm going to do one more thing before we knock off for the day and let this dry overnight or cure overnight. But because this billet here is so thin, there's not a lot of material right here to build up a handle, because I don't want my handle just to be that. I'm actually going to build this up so that it's a little bit more comfortable for me. And so what I'm going to do is rasp this flat and just take another block and laminate right there. But in order to do that, I'm going to have to flatten it out. All right, so our epoxy is all dry on the handle and then the pieces that we laminated on there. Now, at this point, you could go ahead, slide that back in there. You could go ahead and just shape these things up and build the bow as it is. Put a leather handle wrap on here. I've seen where guys have done it just like that and it turns out fine. I like for my handles to have a little bit more contour than just a straight grip like this. And so what I'm gonna do is build this up with some just regular body filler, Bondo body filler. And then I'll be able to shape that to however I want it. Now, I'm gonna do that before I do any shaping on the bow itself, and especially these riser, get that back in there, these riser parts right here, because I want to build that Bondo up thick enough so that it flows right into the limb. So the handle kind of flows right into the limb. Now, you might think, well, Bondo is going to look terrible on this bow, and you're right if you left it like this. But once you build this thing up, I'm going to put a rawhide handle wrap on there, and you'd never know that it wasn't wood under there. If you have the bow together, you'd never know that it wasn't a one-piece bow. So what I've done is I've sanded this metal sleeve with 80 grit sandpaper, and then I've cleaned it off with some of the acetone that I was using earlier. Now I'm going to go ahead and mix up my Bondo and stick it on there. Now before I do that, I am going to, this bottom right here where the Bondo is actually going to meet this wood, I've sanded this down fairly smooth, and I'm going to spray some mold release on here. This is the same stuff that I use for making my fiberglass two-piece takedowns. If you don't have this, most of you won't have it, you could use petroleum jelly, any kind of oil, PAM would work, but you just want to spray this area right here so that when you put that Bondo on there, it doesn't stick to this limb and stick the bow together. All right, so now I'm going to slide this back together. Give it a little tap so it sits down on there just right. And now we can go ahead and put our Bondo on there and build everything up. All right, so the Bondo is all cured out. I'm just going to round these fades off, shape the handle up roughly. So you can see already how this is going to make a much nicer handle than just the straight up metal sleeve. But I'll be able to shape this up just exactly the way I want it. And from this point out, bow building process is exactly the same as any other two-piece takedown bow. I'm just going to bring these in a little bit, shape up these fades, clean these up, draw the profile, and so on. All right, so we've got this bow all done. The fit is really nice and tight. There's not any wiggle in this thing. Once you get it in there, give it a little tap. It's solid as a rock. Now, this handle, you can cover this with any of the grip material. You can put a beaver tail grip on there. You can put rawhide over it. Any kind of leather or rawhide handle wrap is gonna look fine. And I've got other videos on YouTube showing you how to do those things. And when you cover this handle, you would never know that this was a two-piece until you take it apart. All right, so that's gonna wrap it up for this video. Again, if you haven't subscribed, go ahead and do that. And I mentioned my Patreon site earlier. If you are into bow building or you wanna advance in your bow building, I highly encourage you to go check that out. It's just a few bucks a month, and there are hours and hours of exclusive bow building content over there that's gonna help you excel in your bow building. It's going to really cut the learning curve. So go over there, check that out. I'm going to give you a link down in the video description, and we'll see you guys next time.